And now I'd like to invite one of the main architects of this conference, Dr. David Guinn, to give us an overview of the goals of the conference and what to expect. Oh, there you are, I'm sorry. David is a research professor as well as a senior associate at the Center for International Development, and David is sort of the epitome of both research and then taking that research and putting it into action.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. What I will be doing is providing an overview of the conference and also trying to give you an idea of some of the motivations and ideas and why are we doing this kind of conference. Clearly, we can look at the problems of trafficking, we can look at the problems of violent extremism, and we know that they're both important. According to the ILO, there are over 25 million victims of trafficking in the world today. According to the ILO, 80% of those are victims suffering under labor trafficking conditions. 20% suffer in the sex industry and sexual exploitation. According to the UN, it's 50-50. So understanding the problem of trafficking, which we've been struggling with for years, is still a subject of an enormous debate and discussion. When we look at violent extremism and conflict, we have the UN reports that there are 65 million people.
I'm not sure if your microphone's on.
Can you hear me? Okay. There are 65 million displaced people in the world. 55% of those come from Syria, Afghanistan, and Sudan. Clearly, these are enormous problems. But why are we putting them together? Why do we look and say this is an issue of trafficking and violent extremism?
Speak closer to the microphone. Bring the microphone closer to you.
Is anybody having trouble hearing? Okay. Looking at this overview, you can see that there is a connection or a correlation between trafficking and events of violent extremism and conflict. We want to know why and what it's about. In thinking about this project and bringing these issues together, there were basically kind of four concerns that I came up with that I thought were relevant. First one is to recognize that trafficking and advances in the fight against trafficking have advanced when they have captured the public mood and the public will. If you look, historically, if you look at the issues of slavery and so forth, in the 1800s you had the problem of chattel slavery. It caught the zeitgeist, and it was addressed through the 1800s. During the 1900s, there were efforts to address trafficking. There were efforts to address issues of labor exploitation. But the ones that succeeded, interestingly, were in early 1900s, there was an international convention to prohibit the trafficking of white women for sexual exploitation. By the middle of the century, they took out the white part, but they emphasized trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Attention was drawn simply because of the salaciousness, the activity of sexual activity caught attention. The same thing happened when the United States came and moved into the area of trafficking. There had been long activism to try and get the United States engaged internationally in terms of fighting trafficking, in terms of labor, and in terms of exploitation that had not really succeeded. Then in the 1900s, a rather unlikely alliance occurred between white evangelical Christians and feminists. The Christians became outraged by the exploitation of the trafficking for sexual exploitation of women and children. It caught a passion within the public and started moving within the Congress. Labor activists recognized the power of the moment, and they seized on it. And they worked so that they included within the definition of trafficking, not only trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation, but also trafficking for purposes of labor exploitation. The Trafficking Act 2000, passed by the United States, is perhaps the most influential and important international achievement in the fight against trafficking. There had been the initial efforts throughout the world. There had been conventions about trying to fight these kinds of abuses. But with the United States, they developed two significant enforcement mechanisms within the law. One is that they mandated that the State Department issue an annual report on trafficking. The idea was to identify trafficking throughout the world and identify the role that the countries played within it and rank them according to whether or not they were respecting human rights or whether they were violating human rights. So the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Tier 3 represents failing to protect human rights. And it is a method of public naming and shaming. The second key feature within the 2000 Act was the fact that the United States linked foreign aid to compliance with protecting against trafficking. So the countries in Tier 3 were subject to the loss of foreign aid assistance. Critical movement, but it was a movement that captured the zeitgeist of the time. At this point, I would suggest, and if you look at the national budget, violent extremism and the fight against violent extremism is similarly on the rise, and attention of the public and of the governments to fight. Therefore, as an activist, somebody fighting against trafficking, bringing these two related areas together offers us a political opportunity to challenge and advance the fight in the new direction. The second crucial feature that we were looking at is that if we are going to fight these problems, we need to understand them. We need effective research on the problems. And in this case, we need research that looks at them in relationship to each other. In the 1990s, when we were talking about trafficking, trafficking was largely viewed as a binary activity. There were source countries where victims were identified, recruited, or procured. And there were destination countries where those people were going to be exploited. At that time, the International Human Rights Law Institute at DePaul University College of Law initiated a regional study of 9 countries in Central America, the Caribbean, and including Brazil, that was trying to look at the trafficking not just as a source and destination, but to try and understand it in a regional focus. The work that was being done by Early, and I was the executive director of the Institute, the work that was being done by Early really clarified the fact that in order to understand trafficking and in order to deal with the problem, you had to understand that it's not binary. You have to understand that there are 3 phases within trafficking. There is the procurement, recruitment, or coercion phase. There is a transit, taking the person from their point of origin to the point of exploitation. And then there's the demand or the exploitation point. In the trafficking report, countries are now evaluated according to those 3 criteria. Is that country a source country of victims? Is it a transit country, a country through which these illegal routes pass? Or is it a destination country? In our research, one of the things that we found out was, first, that trafficking is not necessarily international. For example, in Brazil, trafficking occurred in the country. There were massive construction projects in Brazil where they were building dams or large excavation and mines. They would bring in large populations of workers, put them in workers' camps, and traffickers would then go and recruit very frequently from minority indigenous communities and bring the women and children from those communities to brothels in the work camps. The second feature of trafficking that we discovered is that trafficking can be one organization doing that, from recruitment to exploitation, or it can be a linkage of network, where there is a recruiter who sells to a trafficker who then sells to the brothel. Third is the trafficking we think of, or at that point we had thought of it as being recruitment and then transit to the country of destination, whereas in fact a lot of trafficking is sequential or iterative. That is to say, a person is recruited into trafficking, is transited to some place, is exploited at a brothel, for example, and then resold, transited to another brothel, and then exploited there. And because we were looking at Latin America, you could trace this all the way up from Colombia north as the individuals flow. Fourth feature that we discovered is that within that flow, it is not necessarily clear that a source country is necessarily the origin of where the person becomes trafficked. For example, specifically, one of the things that we discovered is that a lot of times when people were migrating, seeking employment in a country, in most cases they were heading north to the United States, they could fall into trafficking during the course of their journey. They get in a wrong truck with somebody giving them a ride. They are robbed of all their goods, and they are left destitute, and they need help, and they then become vulnerable to trafficking. So they can actually become trafficking victims by mistake or misadventure. And consequently, if we're looking at ways to address or counter those, we have to understand the flows. We have to understand the system. And so the idea here is that we want to look at the connection between violent extremism and trafficking. If people do, in fact, fall into trafficking by misadventure, then the mere fact that violent extremism is driving them out of their homes means that they're vulnerable. Means that it is putting these people at risk to be trafficked, either from the country in order to escape the country, or once they've fled, then they are vulnerable for recruitment when they're in detention camps or when they're in transit seeking refuge someplace else. The third motivation for this is that we are looking at methodologies. We are encouraging research and we want to promote research. And within that, we have two areas. Both trafficking and violent extremism exist in the shadows. They're not something that are easily studied. And we think that it's quite possible that methodologies that have been used and developed by people in researching trafficking in persons may be useful to those researchers who are looking at violent extremism, and vice versa. So we are trying to promote a dialogue and a sharing of this. And then finally, within this context, we're wanting research that we can refine into practice and intervention. And so throughout the day, we will be looking at emphasizing that. Now, we've got 4 basic panels today. Crucial thing within the panels is that we are going to have presentations by experts on various areas, and we are going to have time for discussion and conversation and questions. And we consider the discussion as on par with the presentations, because all of our presenters have agreed that they're excited to hear what you have to say and to engage in a fruitful dialogue. As the Vice Provost suggested, this is in fact intended as a workshop. We want to promote a conversation. We want to promote learning. Throughout the course of the day, we have a series of questions that I think need to frame how we think and what we're looking at. And these will be, I'm going to review them now, and then at the 4th session, we will revert to them and try and see if we did come up with some of the answers. So, as I suggested, in trafficking persons, there are 3 critical phases in trafficking: the origin, source or cause, transit, and destination or exploitation point. We'll start by considering the relationship between between trafficking in persons and violent extremism in each of these phases. In terms of origin, source, or cause, we know that individuals who are in severe distress due to economics, poverty, discrimination, or personal threat to safety and security are vulnerable to becoming victims of trafficking, either to recruitment, misadventure, or coercion. First question is the issue simply one of forced displacement? If the issue is simply one of forced displacement, is there any differences among the causes? Poverty, economic need, criminal violence, political violence, or violent extremism? Is there something unique about violent extremism in driving individuals towards victimization? How does it affect the victim? Are they more susceptible to victimization? Are they more compliant as victims because they come out of a situation of violent extremism? And third, is violent extremism profiting from trafficking in persons? Might that offer a fruitful avenue for countering violent extremism? In terms of transit, what role does violent extremist organizations play in transit? Are they linked with existing national or international criminal networks? And if so, how might that affect current approaches to countering trafficking persons against transnational criminal organizations? Do violent extremist organizations operate independently? Do they create or utilize existing violent extremist networks? And how might that affect countering trafficking persons? Then in terms of destination point of exploitation, how do violent extremist organizations acquire trafficking victims? How do violent extremist organizations use victims? And does the existence of trafficking victim exploitation offer a different avenue for intervention? In terms of research issues, the ones that I'd like to focus on are researchers looking at violent extremism and trafficking in persons face a number of the same challenges. Both operate in the shadows and outside the bounds of the law. Both are surrounded by the problems that victims are often unable or unwilling to share information. One, based on our review of the literature, researchers looking at trafficking in persons have only begun to consider violent extremism as a significant issue in their research. Is violent extremist research looking at trafficking in person as an important issue? Two, are there violent extremist research methodologies that countering in trafficking in persons researchers should be using? Three, are there trafficking in person research methodologies that violent extremist researchers should be looking at? And four, are there available resources on violent extremism and trafficking in persons that researchers should be looking at? These are the kind of overview questions that we're hoping to address today. Once again, we are looking forward to your participation and engagement in the conversation. Thank you.